I lived two lives, the professional officer who makes life or death decisions and the daughter who had to tone it down so I wouldn't intimidate my brothers. For as long as I can remember, my existence was carved directly down the middle by an invisible, razor-sharp line. On one side of that line stood a woman who wore a heavy tactical uniform, a commander who coordinated multi-agency operations where a single second of hesitation could mean the difference between a successful rescue and a recovery mission. On the other side stood the eldest daughter, who was expected to leave her spine, her competence, and her achievements at the front door of her parents' home, slipping into a pair of soft slippers and an even softer persona just to keep the peace. Welcome to the final bearing stories. If you have ever felt like you had to shrink yourself so others wouldn't feel small, or if you know the weight of carrying a family's silent resentment, take a moment to subscribe and join our community of listeners who understand the cost of quiet strength. The moment I stopped apologizing for my intensity, I realized they were never intimidated by me. They were jealous of the person I had become. But arriving at that realization required a level of pain that almost broke me. It required sitting at a beautifully set dining table, watching the people who were supposed to protect my heart systematically attempt to dismantle my mind. It required watching my mother frantically polish silver while ignoring the rot in her own household. Watching my father retreat into the amber haze of his scotch, and watching my adult brothers Julian and Robert preen like spoiled princes while their lives quietly collapsed under the weight of their own unearned privilege. That evening, the air in the dining room was thick with a familiar, suffocating tension. I had just come off a grueling shift, my muscles aching from the cold, damp air of the northern operations sector where we had been reinforcing river embankments. My mind was still processing logistics, response times, and personnel deployments. I was exhausted down to my very bones. I wanted nothing more than a quiet meal, a moment of familial warmth, or perhaps a simple, genuine inquiry about how I was holding up under the immense seasonal pressure. But in our household, weakness was preyed upon and strength was treated as an act of open defiance. "You're doing it again, Clara," my mother said, her voice dripping with that passive-aggressive sweetness she used like a scalpel. She didn't look at me, she was busy arranging the peas on her plate. "That face, it's like you're interrogating the roast beef. We're just having a family dinner, darling. You don't need to look at us like we're suspects in a criminal lineup, can't you just?" "Relax for once," Julian smirked, taking a slow sip of his wine. "She can't, Mum. Clara's always on duty, probably checking the room for exit strategies." "Tell us, Clara, are we safe from the local neighborhood watch? Or do we need to call in a tactical strike because the neighbor's dog barked?" The joke was old, tired, and designed to do one thing: reduce my profession, my dedication, and my survival instincts to a ridiculous, neurotic quirk. Robert chuckled, a nervous, sycophantic sound, looking at my father for approval. My father simply stared at his plate, cutting his meat with slow, deliberate movements, refusing to intervene. "I'm just tired, Julian," I said, keeping my voice level, low, and devoid of the irritation that was beginning to prickle at the back of my neck. In my line of work, raising your voice is a sign of a lost control. The moment you shout, you lose the room. I had trained myself to speak with a quiet, authoritative clarity that carried more weight than any scream. But in this room, that very control was viewed as an act of aggression. "See, there it is," Julian said, throwing his hands up in mock defeat. "That tone, it's so intense, Clara, you're not commanding a unit right now, you're with your family. We don't need the grand warden routine. It's exhausting. Honestly, it's no wonder you spend your holidays alone. Who could handle that level of rigidity over breakfast?" The words were meant to cut, to strike at the solitary nature of my life. They didn't know about the deep bonds of trust I shared with my team, the people who had looked me in the eyes while the world was burning around us and knew they could trust my voice to lead them out of the dark. My family didn't want to know that version of me. They wanted the version they could patronize, the young girl who used to seek their approval before she realized that their approval was a currency that depreciated the moment you achieved anything real. "She's right, you know," Robert chimed in, emboldened by Julian's lead. "You have this way of making everyone feel like they're under a microscope. It's a bit much, Clara. We're just trying to have a nice evening. You don't have to bring the weight of the world to the table." I looked at my father. Surely the man who had spent 40 years enforcing the law, who understood the burden of judgment and the absolute necessity of structure, would say something. But he only looked up, his eyes clouded with age and a deep, self-imposed blindness. "Your brothers are just saying you should try to be softer, Clara," he said, his voice flat, carrying the weight of a man who had long surrendered his authority to avoid conflict. A woman in your position. It's easy to lose touch with the gentler things. You've always been headstrong, but there's a time to be a daughter and a time to be an officer. You seem to have forgotten how to do the former. The room seemed to shrink. The silence that followed was heavy with their collective satisfaction. They had delivered their verdict. They had successfully framed my competence as a character flaw, my discipline as an emotional defect, and my professional success as a barrier to their affection. I looked at the four of them, sitting under the warm, ambient light of the dining room, surrounded by the expensive things my father's career had bought, and I felt a profound, freezing sense of detachment. I realized with absolute clarity that they were never actually intimidated by my intensity. They were terrified of the mirror it held up to their own comfortable, undisciplined lives. They needed me to be broken, or at least softened, so they wouldn't have to feel the sharp edge of their own stagnation. I picked up my napkin, dabbed my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I did not argue, I did not defend myself. I simply stood up, looked at them with the calm, unblinking focus that had guided me through the worst disasters of my career, and walked out. To understand the distance between my family and me, you have to understand the path I took to get here. I grew up in a household where appearance was the ultimate currency. My father, Magistrate Arthur Vance, was a man whose public reputation was built on his unyielding adherence to the law, his sharp mind, and his dignified carriage. At the courthouse, he was a pillar of the community. At home, however, he was a man who craved absolute peace at any psychological cost. He did not want to deal with the messy, complicated realities of raising children. He wanted trophies. Julian, as the firstborn son, was his golden hope, but Julian was soft. He possessed our father's charm but none of his work ethic, his intelligence but none of his discipline. Whenever Julian stumbled, my mother was there to catch him, whispering excuses into my father's ear, shielding her darling boy from the consequences of failed exams, ruined cars, and abandoned university courses. Robert, observing this, quickly learned that the easiest way to survive was to mimic Julian's helplessness. If you never tried to stand on your own 2 feet, you could never be blamed for falling down. And then there was me. The eldest daughter, born with my father's analytical mind and an internal compass that demanded order and purpose. While my brothers were allowed to sleep in, to neglect their chores, and to drift through their teenage years with zero accountability, I was held to a different standard, not by my parents, but by myself. I saw the quiet hypocrisy of our home early on. I saw how my mother's frantic perfectionism was a shield to hide the fact that our family was built on a foundation of emotional sand. I saw how my father used his scotch and his study to escape the noisy reality of his son's failures. I chose a path that horrified them. Instead of pursuing a comfortable, prestigious career in corporate law or finance, something my father could boast about at his club, I entered the public safety sector. I joined the Regional Emergency Operations and Tactical Response Command. I wanted to be where the decisions mattered. I wanted to be in the room when the alarm sounded, when the automated systems failed, when natural disasters or human negligence pushed communities to the brink of catastrophe. My training was brutal. It stripped away the last vestiges of my need for superficial approval. In the academy and later in the field, I learned that under pressure, you do not rise to the occasion. You sink to the level of your training. I learned to read a room in seconds, to identify structural weaknesses in buildings and in human character, and to make hard, unpopular decisions under extreme duress. I became a tactical operations commander, responsible for coordinating multi-agency responses to high-stakes emergencies, fires, industrial chemical spills, search and rescue operations, and civil disruptions. My family, however, viewed my career as a vulgar eccentricity. To my mother, my uniform was unfeminine, my shift work an embarrassment that interfered with family gatherings, and my professional stories too grim for polite conversation. "Must you always talk about accidents, Clara?" she would sigh during the rare Sunday lunches I managed to attend. "It's so morbid. Surely there are office jobs in the department where you don't have to wear those heavy boots." My brothers found my position to be a source of constant, low-grade resentment. As Julian's business ventures failed one after another, each one quietly liquidated by my father to preserve the family name, my steady ascent through the ranks of the regional command became an unspoken threat. I was buying my own home, managing my finances with military precision, and earning the genuine respect of municipal leaders and emergency services chiefs. When I spoke, people listened. Not because I was Arthur Vance's daughter, but because I was Commander Clara Vance, the woman who had successfully managed the evacuation of the lower valley during the Great Floods of 2024. This success created a profound, unspoken imbalance in our family dynamic. The strong daughter syndrome is a strange, isolating phenomenon. When you are the disciplined, high responsibility child, your family stops seeing you as someone who needs support, comfort, or even basic empathy. You become the oak tree in the yard, expected to withstand every storm, to provide shade for everyone else, and to never complain when your own roots are dry. They rely on your strength, yet they despise you for it because it highlights their own weakness. My mother began to rely on me to handle the practical crises she was too emotionally fragile to face. When my father had his first minor stroke 3 years ago, it wasn't Julian or Robert who coordinated with the specialists, organized the home care, and restructured his medication schedules. It was me. I did it with the same tactical efficiency I applied to a multi-car pileup on the motorway. I created spreadsheets, set up automated reminders, and negotiated with the insurance underwriters. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because it needed to be done, and because no one else in that house was capable of doing it without collapsing into a puddle of dramatic self-pity. But instead of gratitude, my efficiency was met with a quiet, insidious hostility. "You're treating your father like one of your cases, Clara." My mother wept one evening after I had spent 3 hours correcting a dangerous medication error Julian had made while watching him. "He's your father, not a patient. You're so cold, you have no warmth in you." Julian, furious that his negligence had been exposed, turned the narrative against me. "She just wants to control everything, Mum. She loves being the boss. It makes her feel important because she has nothing else in her life." I remember standing in the hallway of their large, comfortable home, listening to their voices drift from the drawing room, and feeling a deep, aching emptiness. I had spent my rest day driving across 2 counties to secure my father's specialized medication, and this was the result. I was the cold one, I was the controller, I was the one who was too intense. Over the next 2 years, I began to practice what I called tactical withdrawal. I stopped volunteering for family duties. I stopped offering advice on Julian's endless financial disasters. I limited my visits to major holidays and the occasional forced dinner. I learned to mask my professional intensity when I was with them, speaking in soft, noncommittal tones, nodding politely at Julian's ridiculous business proposals, and ignoring Robert's passive-aggressive barbs. I tried to dim my light so they would let me exist in peace, but masking is an exhausting process. It requires you to constantly monitor your posture, your tone, and your expressions, to suppress your natural instincts to solve problems, and to pretend that you do not see the slow-motion train wreck happening right in front of you. It is a form of psychological self-harm, undertaken in the vain hope that if you make yourself small enough, the people who are supposed to love you will finally stop biting at your heels. And yet, despite my best efforts to shrink, the tension only grew. My silence was interpreted as superiority, my emotional restraint was labeled as arrogance. The dinner party where Julian had mocked me was the final straw. As I drove away from their house that night, the city lights reflecting off the wet asphalt of the highway, I made a promise to myself. I was done apologizing for the person I had become to survive. I was done trying to fit my expansive, highly trained life into the narrow, suffocating box of their expectations. If they wanted a soft, compliant daughter who would nod at their lies and ignore their incompetence, they would have to find her elsewhere. I was a commander. I was a leader. And it was time I started treating my personal life with the same uncompromising standard of truth that I brought to my professional command. The transition from the late autumn into the harsh, wet winter of 2026 brought with it an unprecedented level of operational strain. Our regional command center was operating on high alert. A series of severe Atlantic low-pressure systems had battered the coast, pushing our inland waterways and drainage infrastructure to their absolute limits. As the tactical operations commander, my days were filled with hydrological reports, coordinate mapping, and endless coordination meetings with the regional fire services, police, and municipal engineering departments. It was during this period of intense professional focus that the cracks in my family's fragile structure began to open into chasms. Julian, in his infinite wisdom, had decided to invest the remainder of his trust fund, along with a substantial personal loan co-signed by my father, into a high-risk development project. He had purchased a defunct industrial estate on the low-lying plains of the River Severn Basin, intending to convert the old warehouses into trendy, low-cost artisan workspaces and storage units. He had ignored the environmental assessments, dismissed the local authorities' flood warnings as bureaucratic red tape designed to stifle entrepreneurs, and rushed the acquisition through before the winter rains set in. I only found out about the investment when my father called me, his voice sounding older and more frail than usual, asking if I could use my connections in the planning office to expedite some permits Julian's development company was struggling to secure. Clara, it's your brother's future, my father had pleaded, his tone a mixture of his old courtroom authority and a desperate, underlying panic. He's put everything into this, your mother and I have. Well, we've supported him significantly. If this project gets delayed by the winter, the holding costs will ruin him. Just make a few calls, you know the regional planners. I sat at my desk, looking at the screen displaying the current regional flood risk map. The entire zone where Julian's property sat was highlighted in deep warning red. It was a primary floodplain designated as an active runoff basin. Dad, I said, my voice steady but dead serious, I can't make those calls. And even if I could, Julian's project is a disaster waiting to happen. That land is zoned for active flood storage. It is designed to go underwater so the residential sectors upstream don't. If he has stored materials or equipment there, he needs to evacuate them immediately. The weather patterns for the next 3 weeks are highly unstable. There was a long pause on the line, followed by a heavy, disappointed sigh. You see, this is what your mother talks about, Clara. You can never just help. You always have to turn everything into an emergency, into a lecture. You've become so cynical, so unwilling to support your own blood. Julian has a vision, you just want to see him fail so you can prove you were right. I am looking at the hydrological telemetry right now, Dad, I replied, the cold professionalism of my training taking over. This isn't an opinion, it's physics. If the river breaches the northern barrier, that entire estate will be under 4 feet of water within 12 hours. Tell Julian to pull his assets out. Now, goodbye, Clara, my father said and hung up. 2 weeks later, the storm of the decade made landfall. It began as a steady, relentless downpour that saturated the ground within 48 hours. By the third day, the small tributaries feeding into the River Severn were running at peak capacity. Our command center in the city became a war room. We had activated our emergency response protocols, coordinating sandbagging efforts, setting up temporary shelters, and monitoring the river levels minute by minute. I had been on duty for 36 hours straight, surviving on black coffee and adrenaline, my eyes fixed on the telemetry screens that tracked the rising water. At 3:00 a.m. on a Tuesday, the situation deteriorated dramatically. A critical retaining wall at the old canal lock, 5 miles upstream from the industrial estate Julian had bought, began to show signs of structural failure. If that wall gave way, a massive surge of water would bypass the primary overflow channels and pour directly into the low-lying commercial valley, exactly where Julian's development sat. My phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was unrecognizable, a high-pitched, hysterical shriek that cut through the low hum of the command center. Clara, you have to help us. Oh my God, Clara, please. I stepped away from the main console, my voice instantly dropping into the calm, authoritative register I used when managing panicked callers on the emergency lines. Mum, calm down, take a deep breath. Tell me exactly where you are and what is happening. We're at Julian's development. She wailed, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Julian said. He said he had to save the equipment. He bought hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of solar panels and industrial heaters, and they were delivered yesterday. He didn't insure them yet, Clara. He said if they get ruined, he'll be bankrupted, and your father. Your father signed his house as collateral for the loan. We all came down to help him move them to the upper level of the warehouse. Robert is here and your father. Oh God, Clara, your father has collapsed? A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my chest, but my face remained completely expressionless. My training took over, cataloging the details of her report with clinical precision. Location, Sector 4, low-lying industrial plain. Assets, 4 civilians, 1 unresponsive or semi-conscious elderly male with a history of stroke. Hazard, imminent structural breach of upstream lock, rapid inundation risk. Is Dad conscious? I asked, my voice cutting through her panic like a steel blade. I don't know. He's breathing, but he's white as a sheet and he can't get up. Julian and Robert are trying to carry him, but the water is already coming up through the floor drains. It's cold, Clara, it's so cold. The road outside is covered in water. We tried to drive the SUVs out, but Julian's van got stuck in the mud at the gate and it's blocking the only exit road. We're trapped. You have to send the rescue boats. You have to save us. I looked across the command center at the massive tactical display screen. The Severn Lock barrier was showing 98% structural stress. Our predictive models indicated a catastrophic failure within 20 minutes. The estimated time for the flood wave to reach Sector 4 was less than 12 minutes. And my family was sitting directly in its path, trapped because they had prioritized a pile of uninsured cargo over common sense, and because their pride had prevented them from listening to the one person who could have kept them safe. I felt a sudden, fleeting urge to scream, to ask them how they could be so monumentally, unspeakably foolish. I had spent my entire life being lectured by these people about my intensity, about how my rigid adherence to rules and safety was an emotional defect. And now they were drowning in the very chaos their lack of discipline had created, begging me to use that same intensity to pull them out of the grave they had dug for themselves. But there was no time for anger. In the command room, personal feelings are a luxury that can cost lives. I closed my eyes for 1 second, let the frustration wash through me, and then let it go. Mum, listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying an absolute, unshakable authority that allowed no room for argument or hysteria. You are going to stop crying and you are going to do exactly what I tell you to do. Do you understand me? Yes, yes, Clara, she whispered, her voice trembling but suddenly quieted by the sheer weight of my tone. Take your father up to the highest point of the main warehouse. Do not try to move the equipment. Leave it. Do you hear me? Leave everything. Julian and Robert must carry your father immediately to the mezzanine level. Do not attempt to wade through the water outside to clear the van. The current is already too strong and the road surfaces are compromised. Get inside, get high, and stay together. I am initiating the rescue protocol now. Please, Clara, don't let us die here, she sobbed. Do exactly as I said, I will see you soon. I hung up the phone and walked back to the central operations desk. The room was buzzing with activity, but the moment I stepped up to the podium, my team looked at me, sensing the shift in my posture. I was no longer just managing the regional map. I was now commanding a rescue operation where the stakes were deeply, painfully personal. Listen up, I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the busy operations floor. We have a critical life safety incident developing in Sector 4, Severn Industrial Estate. We have 4 confirmed civilian casualties trapped in Warehouse 3. 1 elderly male, unresponsive, history of stroke, cardiovascular distress. 3 ambulatory adults. The access road is fully compromised due to a blocked exit and rising water levels. The canal lock upstream is showing imminent failure. We have a window of less than 15 minutes before the primary surge hits that sector. My deputy, Sarah, looked up from her terminal, her fingers flying across her keyboard. Commander, the local fire service units are already fully deployed in the residential sectors of the lower valley. Their water rescue teams are stretched to the limit. It will take them at least 40 minutes to redeploy a boat crew to Sector 4. We don't have 40 minutes, I said calmly. If they wait 40 minutes, the water level in that basin will be over 8 feet, and the structural integrity of those old warehouses is unverified under hydrodynamic load. We need a fast water rescue asset immediately. I zoomed the map in on the sector. I knew this area better than anyone. I had spent months reviewing the municipal emergency plans, identifying the gaps in our defenses. There is a specialist search and rescue boat unit from the Volunteer Reserve stationed at the North Marina, I said, pointing to a small icon on the screen. They have 2 rigid-hulled inflatable boats with high-power outboards. They are trained for rapid current navigation. Sarah, contact their team leader, Captain Miller. Tell him Commander Vance is requesting an immediate emergency deployment under Protocol 9. I will meet them at the staging point at the North Bridge. Sarah stared at me in surprise. Commander, you're going out yourself? You're the incident commander here, you need to stay at the center. My deputy is fully qualified to maintain the regional grid, I said, looking her dead in the eye. The incident command for this specific rescue requires local tactical knowledge of the industrial estate's layout. I know the warehouse entry points, the utility shutoffs, and the specific hazards of that site. I can direct the boat team faster than anyone from this room. Maintain the log, Sarah. You have the comms. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my high-visibility waterproof tactical jacket, my heavy-duty radio harness, and my helmet. As I walked out of the command center, the cool, rain-slicked air of the night hit my face, clearing the fog of the long hours I had worked. For the first time in years, I felt a strange, crystalline sense of peace. The doubts, the passive-aggressive dinner table comments, the accusations of being too intense, all of it was stripped away, replaced by the beautiful, absolute simplicity of a tactical problem that needed a solution. 10 minutes later, my SUV pulled up to the North Bridge staging point. The rain was falling in solid, driving sheets, the wind whipping the river into a gray, frothing frenzy. The headlights of the volunteer rescue truck cut through the darkness, illuminating two rigid-hulled boats on trailers, their crew already clad in dry suits and life jackets. Captain Miller, a weathered veteran of the Coast Guard who had spent his retirement training volunteers, ran up to my window as I stepped out. "Commander Vance, glad you're here. The river is rising faster than we expected. We've just received word that the Severn Lock barrier has breached. The surge is on its way down the channel. It's going to be a rough ride into that basin." "We go in now, Miller," I said, fastening my helmet strap. "The casualties are in Warehouse 3 on the mezzanine level." The warehouse is located at the southern end of the estate. The main entrance is blocked by a white delivery van that has been swamped. We will have to navigate the boat through the secondary loading bay doors on the eastern side. They are roller shutter doors. If they are down, we'll need to breach them. "We've got a portable hydraulic cutter in the boat," Miller nodded, his face serious. "But we'll have to move fast. Once the surge hits, the debris in the water is going to turn that estate into a washing machine." I climbed into the lead boat, securing my harness to the lifeline. The engine roared to life, a deep, comforting vibration that echoed off the concrete underside of the bridge. We slid into the dark, swirling waters of the river, the boat bouncing violently as it met the main current. As we navigated down the channel, the world around us dissolved into a blur of dark water, driving rain, and the flashing blue lights of emergency vehicles on the distant bridges. I kept my eyes fixed on my ruggedized tactical tablet, tracking our position relative to the rising water levels. We turned into the entrance of the industrial estate. It was unrecognizable. The neat asphalt roads and manicured verges were gone, replaced by a vast, swirling lake of brown water. Trash cans, wooden pallets, and plastic chemical drums floated past us, bobbing like modern-day mines in the dark. "There's the warehouse," Miller shouted over the roar of the engine and the wind, pointing his searchlight toward a large, dark metal building. The water was already halfway up the ground floor windows. At the main gate, Julian's massive delivery van was tilted at a precarious angle, its front end submerged, the rising water swirling around its cabin. It was a monument to his stubbornness, a physical manifestation of the family's refusal to listen to warnings. We bypassed the van and navigated the boat toward the eastern side of the building. The roller shutter door of the loading bay was partially open, about 3 feet from the water's surface. "We can squeeze the boat through," I yelled to the helm officer. "Keep it low. Watch your heads." The boat slid under the heavy metal shutter, the metal scraping against our helmets with a screech that sounded like a dying animal. We emerged into the cavernous, echoing interior of the warehouse. The scene inside was chaotic. The water was about 4 feet deep, oily and black, reflecting the beams of our searchlights. Hundreds of cardboard boxes containing Julian's precious, uninsured solar panels were floating in the water, their cardboard disintegrating, their expensive components sinking into the muck. And there, at the back of the warehouse, on a raised metal mezzanine platform 10 feet above the water, stood my family. My mother was huddled in a corner, wrapped in a wet blanket, her face pale and streaked with tears. Robert was pacing back and forth, his hands over his ears, his corporate composure completely shattered. Julian was kneeling beside my father, who lay on a wooden pallet covered in a dirty tarpaulin, his breathing shallow and rapid. The searchlight from our boat hit them, illuminating their terrified, exhausted faces. As the boat approached the metal stairs of the mezzanine, they looked down at us. Through the driving rain and the darkness, they didn't see the cold, unfeeling daughter who was too intense for their dinners. They saw their commander, they saw their savior. The boat nudged against the metal staircase, the engine idling with a low, controlled thrum. I unclipped my harness, stepped onto the wet metal steps, and climbed up to the mezzanine. My movements were calm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the frantic energy that was vibrating through my family. The moment my mother saw me, she let out a broken sob and reached for me, but I stepped past her, my eyes fixed on my father. "Julian." Robert stepped back. I commanded, my voice carrying that quiet, unyielding authority that left no room for hesitation. Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his face wet with rain and tears of shame. He looked small, incredibly small, sitting there amidst the floating ruin of his dreams. Clara, I'm sorry, I didn't think. I thought we had time. Step back, I repeated, not unkindly, but with a clinical firmness that broke no delay. I knelt beside my father. His skin was cold and clammy, his pulse rapid and thready. He looked up at me, his eyes unfocused, but as they cleared slightly, he recognized the uniform, the helmet, and the calm, steady gaze of his daughter. Clara, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain drumming on the metal roof. You. You came. I am here, Dad, I said, my fingers gently checking his carotid pulse, my mind running through the triage protocol. We are going to get you out of here, you are safe now. I looked up at Captain Miller, who had climbed up behind me with the rescue basket. Miller, we need a full spinal board and oxygen. Suspected cardiovascular event, potential secondary stroke. We need to secure him for transit across the water. On it, Commander, Miller said, signaling his crew. Within minutes, my team had secured my father in the rescue basket with the quiet, effortless efficiency of professionals who had performed this drill 1,000 times. Every movement was synchronized, every strap secured with practiced precision. My mother and brothers watched in absolute, stunned silence. They had spent years mocking my profession, viewing my tactical drills as a ridiculous hobby, but now they were watching a masterclass in survival, and their lives depended entirely on the execution of those very protocols. We need to move now, I said, looking at the water level. The main surge from the lock breach is entering the basin. The water is rising an inch every 3 minutes. We loaded my father into the center of the rescue boat, securing his basket to the deck plates. I turned to my mother, Julian, and Robert. Get in, I said, pointing to the remaining seats. Keep your heads down and do not move. If the boat rocks, stay low. Robert scrambled in first, his panic overriding any sense of decorum. Julian helped my mother down, his hands shaking violently. As he climbed into the boat, he looked at the floating boxes of his inventory, then up at me, his lips trembling. It's all gone, Clara, he whispered. Everything, the business, the house, everything. I looked at him, my face expressionless, but inside I felt a deep, profound sense of pity, not for his financial loss, but for his emotional poverty. Your life isn't gone, Julian, be grateful for that. The rest is just paper. The journey back across the flooded basin was treacherous. The water was a swirling torrent, filled with large debris that threatened to puncture our hull. But Captain Miller navigated the boat with expert skill, guided by my tactical map coordinates which kept us clear of the submerged fences and power lines. When we finally reached the North Bridge staging point, the scene was a chaotic hub of emergency services. 3 ambulances were waiting, their red and blue lights painting the wet pavement in vibrant hues. The moment the boat touched the ramp, the paramedics rushed forward. They unloaded my father with swift, professional care, wheeling him toward the lead ambulance. My mother and Robert followed, clutching their blankets, their faces pale under the bright lights of the emergency scene. I stepped out of the boat, my boots hitting the solid, dry ground. I felt the cold rain washing the grime from my face, my muscles screaming with exhaustion, but my mind was perfectly clear. My father was loaded into the ambulance, the doors ready to close. My mother paused at the door, looking back at me. She looked older, smaller, her carefully maintained illusion of maternal superiority completely shattered by the reality of the night. Clara, aren't you coming with us? She asked, her voice trembling. I looked at her standing under the flashing blue lights of the emergency vehicles, surrounded by my team, the people who respected me, the people who knew the true value of my intensity. No, Mum, I said softly, my voice carrying the weight of a final, unshakable boundary. My shift isn't over, I have a region to protect. The paramedics will take care of Dad. I will see you at the hospital when my command is handed over. She looked at me, her eyes filling with a late, quiet regret, realizing that she had spent her life trying to soften the very strength that had just saved her family. She nodded slowly, stepped into the ambulance, and the doors closed. I watched the ambulance pull away, its sirens wailing into the rainy night. I turned back to the command vehicle, ready to debrief my team and coordinate the remaining rescue efforts across the valley. As I walked away, I realized something that changed the entire trajectory of my life. I was never too intense for their dinner table, I was simply too real for their theater of illusions. The moment I stopped apologizing for my intensity was the moment I realized they were never actually intimidated by me. They were simply terrified of the person I had the courage to become. Do you feel like you have to dim your light to fit in with your family? Leave a comment below and let me know, when was the moment you stopped apologizing for your success? Share your story, subscribe to the Final Bearing Stories, and let's walk this path of quiet strength together.